All right, welcome back to our next interview here at Gary's Book Club, and welcome to all of you to 2014 CES. I hope you're having a great show. I'm personally extremely excited about this next interview. It's another book that I've read and can definitely say I learned a lot from. I think anyone can and should read this book because it pertains to an issue that really underlies everything we're here about, and that's innovation and jobs. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Dearie, and he can tell us a little bit about who he is and why he wrote this book, and then we'll get into conversation about some really interesting findings that he and his co-author found when they were out on the road researching. John, welcome.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you to Gary Shapiro for his kind invitation to be here. This is my first time here at the show, and it's just absolutely overwhelming and awesome, so I'm very pleased to be here. My co-author and I should mention from the top that Courtney is very disappointed that she couldn't be here, but sends her sincere regrets. Courtney and I were colleagues. I still am at the Financial Services Forum, which is a financial and economic policy think tank of sorts in Washington, D.C. Courtney was there. She is currently the head of the Washington office at S&P, so we're no longer colleagues, but we were for a number of years. And following the financial crisis and the policy response to the financial crisis, we became very, very interested in the spring of 2011, specifically in the jobs crisis. It became clear to us at that time, at that time we were about 2 years beyond the end of the Great Recession. The recession officially ended in June of 2009. I know a lot of Americans think it never ended. But at least officially it ended in 2009. And yet by the spring of 2011, we were still at unemployment rates above 9%. The economy was growing at maybe 1% or 1.5%. And this is all notwithstanding the fact that we have this massive policy response. We had $800 billion fiscal stimulus. The Federal Reserve, of course, was engaged in unprecedentedly aggressive monetary policy. I think at that point we had at least one round of quantitative easing, and we had about 30 months of zero interest rates thanks to the Fed. And yet the economy just wasn't responding in the way that everybody responded. And most importantly, at that time there were still about 25 million Americans out of work. So it was very clear to us that we were in uncharted territory. And that being in Washington, and you may have sensed this too, Sean, that at that time you could almost feel this sort of collective shrug in Washington about what to do next. They had done what history and the academic textbooks had said had to be done to respond to a huge financial crisis. They had done it, and yet they were not getting the kind of traction that they wanted to get. And so Courtney and I decided that we would try to do a project to generate some new ideas. We weren't really sure what our angle was going to be at first, so we started doing a bunch of research, and very shortly after we began, we came across some research originally done by 3 economists in the DC area on Census Bureau data, and then subsequently reanalyzed at the Kauffman Foundation, which I know that you're familiar with, Sean, out in Kansas City, Missouri, which focuses on entrepreneurship. And what this research showed, and this was a revelation to us, I'm embarrassed to say, because I've been in financial and economic policy for 25 years. I didn't know this, that startups, so many of the people who were here at the show, have accounted for virtually all net new job creation in the U.S. economy over the last 30 years. So if your policy objective is job creation, the innovation economy is the bullseye of that target. And yet, as you know, in Washington, the mantra, and you hear it almost every single day, is small business is the engine of job creation. Small businesses are incredibly important to this country. They account for something like 99% of the businesses in the United States. They account for over half of working Americans, very important parts of our communities. But if your objective is job creation, it's really new businesses, startups, that are really the bullseye.
I think what you came to discover, and kudos to you both for realizing it was a problem that was tackled by Washington. Inevitably, you knew enough to get outside of Washington to really see what was going on elsewhere. I would venture to guess, is it possible that the combination of the dot-com bust and the fact that there was a new president, there was this huge influx of money poured at the problem. The shrug was maybe a combination of what you just said, basically. We've had these problems and we've solved them before. It's not being solved now. Was it the answer was right under our noses, and perhaps, as always, or as typically the case, the biggest problem can be explained painfully easily, and in some regards you found that to be the case.
Yeah, why Washington is not more aware, and I hasten to add that Washington is beginning to wake up to the importance of the innovation economy in important ways, although it's only the beginning, and a lot more work has to be done on a lot more fronts. But of course, last year we had the Jobs Act of 2012, the most important aspect of which I think was the crowdfunding piece of legislation, which is very important. I know entrepreneurs all over the country are very excited about, although there's some frustration about the SEC regulations associated with that. Sure. And then there's another piece of legislation that was reintroduced in 2013 by Senators Warner of Virginia and Moran of Kansas, called the Startup Act 3.0. The principal aspects of which are, I think there are some access to capital aspects of it, there's some regulatory relief aspects to it, and there is a major aspect associated with high-skilled immigration reform to it. And so that's a very important piece of legislation. But it was Courtney's observation, and I think it was a very good one, that because we obviously, we're discussing this as we were on the road that summer, and I should say, there's so many things to cover, but I should say the foundation of this book is, once Courtney and I learned that new businesses are the engine of job creation, we also learned that engine of job creation is sputtering, in the sense that the number of new businesses formed every year, which had remained remarkably consistent for decades and decades and decades, through wars, recessions, what have you, we always had about 500,000 to 600,000 new businesses launched in this country every year. The number of new businesses peaked in 2006 and headed down for the first time. In fact, between 2006 and 2010, the number of new businesses plunged by 25%. So you put those two observations together, and the circumstances that we had are new businesses are the engine of job creation, and that engine of job creation was breaking down at a time that we needed them more than ever. Right. And the question was, why is this happening? And so we decided the best way to find out was to get out of Washington, hit the road, and ask entrepreneurs face-to-face, what's in your way? So with that in mind, we conducted roundtables across the United States in 12 cities, and we really got an earful, as you can imagine.
Sure. Well, and so reading the book, it becomes clear that, and what I alluded to earlier about the biggest question sometimes has the most simple answer, you found that speaking in 12 different cities to 12 different roundtables representing different types of businesses, different types of experience, the answers were remarkably similar. And the proposals for change and progress were on a similar theme. Can you elaborate a little bit on what you heard from these folks?
Sure. The things that we heard won't surprise, I think, anyone here. What makes them so significant, and this is, I think, was the most surprising takeaway, is it was our expectation when we set out on this summer journey doing these roundtables that we would hear different things at different roundtables. Well, we picked our cities very carefully. We wanted to cover the geographic expanse of the country. We also wanted to cover the industrial diversity of the country. As you know, certain cities and regions tend to be associated with certain industries. So we picked our cities in that regard. So we expected to hear different things in different cities. Also, the startup scene in, say, Cambridge, Massachusetts is really different than the startup scene in Columbus, Ohio, or Orlando, Florida, or Seattle, or LA, or all these places we went. And yet, we heard the same half dozen major themes everywhere we went. And as I say, I don't think anyone will be surprised by these, but what makes it significant is that we heard it everywhere we went. Sure. Because when you do, there can be no doubt that these, in fact, are legitimate problems. And maybe I should just run through them. The first one, and this is really amazing in the context of a jobs crisis, and I don't think this will surprise anyone, but there's not enough folks who have the skills that we need. And this is really the skills gap that so much has been talked about and written about. That first problem is further exacerbated by are insane, in the words of our entrepreneurs, and self-defeating high-skilled immigration policies. We're not doing the kind of job that we need to be doing to attract and retain the world's best talent. Thirdly, access to capital problems, and this is always a challenge for entrepreneurs, but we heard that in the wake of the financial crisis, that challenge is even more tough than usual for a number of reasons that we go into in the book. Fourth is a perception among entrepreneurs that over-regulation, particularly regulatory complexity and uncertainty. As we heard folks say, I'm spending way too much time focusing on regulation instead of focusing on my business. Similar comment regarding tax complexity and uncertainty. You know, as a number of people told us, just give me a number and don't change it. I'm happy to pay taxes. I'm not trying to escape taxes, but I can't deal with the moving goalposts and the complexity. And then finally, there's far too much economic uncertainty out there, and, wait for it, it's Washington's fault. And this is everything from the fiscal cliff to the debt ceiling to the general dysfunction in Washington, the not getting tax reform done or high-skilled immigration reform done, all of this sort of bickering and dysfunction in Washington, according to our entrepreneurs, is causing a tremendous amount of economic uncertainty that's undermining their efforts. So those are the things that we heard everywhere we went.
And I think it's very important to underline that there's no prescription necessarily here so much as the wisdom that accumulated from people with experience. And while politics are an inevitable aspect of a lot of these problems, I think it's safe to say that virtually every solution, every suggestion, it crosses political boundaries, and there's no right or wrong, there's no left or right. I think what's troubling to me as someone that lives in D.C. and thought he was moderately well informed, the notion that some of these are pretty simple answers that people of both sides of the fence would eagerly work on together. It's more a matter of posturing and intransigence based on what they think constituents want. I find no shortage of irony in that.
Yeah, I mean, look, everybody in Washington is looking for any new way to create jobs and to accelerate economic growth. Where there's disagreement and where there's politics and posturing, unfortunately, is in the details. What we really hoped that we could accomplish with the message that we brought back from the road back to Washington is to say, look, these are not our ideas. These are not John and Courtney's opinion about what's wrong or what's in these folks' way. We actually took the time, spent the money and energy to spend the summer on the road, do these roundtables, meet with hundreds of entrepreneurs face to face, and to hear it right from them, and then to make policy proposals in response to those 6 major themes that we heard everywhere we went. Many of which came right from the entrepreneurs themselves. We'd be conducting a roundtable and somebody would say, it'd be great if the government did this, or why don't folks in Washington just do that? And Courtney and I would look at each other across the table and we'd write it down because they're, as you say, they're very straightforward, not terribly complicated, good ideas. And in proposing the recommendations that we do in the book, I think you're right, and I appreciate you saying that. We're very, very careful to do it in a nonpartisan way, in a way that we hope, as we say, the jobs crisis is neither Democratic or American or Republican, it's American. And we think that that these ideas that we propose based on what entrepreneurs told us they need are sufficiently obvious, sufficiently simple, and we recognize there are 1,000 ways to skin a cat. But we think that there's a tremendous amount here for policymakers to take on board and to really give serious consideration, and hopefully, like the Startup Act, which enjoys bipartisan support, like the Jobs Act of last year, which enjoyed a tremendous amount of bipartisan support. We're hoping that more of these ideas can get passed, get implemented, and we can get enhance the circumstances for startups, and in doing so, accelerate job creation and get all these millions of folks back to work.
Right, and I think I find reason for encouragement hearing that it was such a universal consensus. When we speak of that polarity, we tend to hear things like if Washington would get out of the way, or Washington can and should solve these problems. I think, as usual, the sweet spot is pretty much right exactly in the middle, and to a certain extent is how it should be. Washington does need to get out of the way, or out of its own way, in terms of over-regulation, senseless regulation, whimsically changing tax codes. But hearing that startups is driving all the jobs virtually, I think it's a positive message for constituents to hear, because those are the people that are looking for the job. So in a sense, we are capable of creating the fix to this, and it's not going to come from a magic check being written or a magic policy. It's really more listen to what these people that have done this are saying.
Right. No, I think that's exactly right. And as I was sitting here listening to you, the other point that I'd love to make is and you and I were talking about this before we came on, that one thing that was made clear to me and to Courtney as we traveled around and as we wrote the book is that the innovation economy and entrepreneurs. Now, the problem here, what I'm about to say is that entrepreneurs and folks in the innovation economy need to be more involved in the policymaking process. Of course, entrepreneurs are very, very busy. They're spending, and they should spend every waking moment, focused on their business, on their product or service, identifying their market, how to reach customers. I get that. One of the things that Courtney observed, and I meant to say this earlier, is that there is no organized a representation specifically with regard to entrepreneurs. There is with innovation, you all have been doing magnificent work for a long, long, long time. But there's no specific organization in Washington focused on startups per se. And that may be part of the reason why Washington policymakers aren't aware of or don't understand or appreciate the unique needs of startups as well as they should, because there's no on-the-ground, day-to-day presence doing the blocking and tackling of engagement and advocacy. But that can change, and it's beginning to change. Entrepreneurs and folks in the innovation economy have a tremendous amount to offer to Washington. That they need to be more active, I think, more organized, and that's happening. I think they also need to be more sophisticated. I think we saw in some of the aspects of lobbying for the Jobs Act and with some of the expressions of frustration associated with the implementation of crowdfunding, some of the expectations about things should just happen like that, or they should happen exactly the way that we envisioned that they would happen. If you spend any time in Washington, you know that that's not the way that Washington works, that you never get everything that you want. But I agree with you entirely that there needs to be more of a dialogue, more of a relationship, ongoing and robust relationship and dialogue between policymakers and the people who are really responsible for innovation, growth, and jobs, and it's the people who are here.
I think being a denizen of Washington and knowing a lot of people that work in politics, hearing them express the frustration that when they go to their constituents in places like Seattle or down south, there's such an insular nature of DC, and unfortunately that's where so much of the op-eds get written. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're not going to learn because we're not listening. I think what's crucially important about this book, and I kept thinking as I was reading it, the best blurb you can get is when someone says, this book needs to fall in this person's hands. I kept thinking, if enough politicians read this book, it'll make a difference, because they'll realize we don't know. And I think at the end of the day, aside from getting votes, most politicians do want things to get better. Most politicians do want to be responsible for being on board with ideas that are going to help solve these problems. What are some of the obstacles? I mean, you are literally spreading awareness, which is great. What are some of the obstacles to getting this book in those hands, or getting past that insular bubble so that people realize we can solve these problems or make strides towards solving them if we get out of our own way?
Yeah, I think it's always hard to break through or to knock down conventional thinking. The conventional thinking that jobs come from either small business or they come from the Fortune 500 companies who, by the way, are both very well represented in Washington, and that helps contribute to the conventional thinking, of course, both in terms of just face time and being on the other side of the table, and policymakers hearing about their problems, and also in terms of campaign support and those types of things. So I think it's very important for policymakers to hear more directly from the innovation economy and entrepreneurs. And I'm talking about the usual steps that interest groups use to press their case. Fly-ins of people. I mean, there ought to be an entrepreneurship day in Washington on an annual basis, if not a biannual basis. The thing that really gets policymakers' attention is visits in their office. I mean, you know this. You've attended enough of these meetings. Real people sitting down on the other side of the table from senators and members of Congress and their staff saying, here's my business, here's what it does, here's what I'm trying to do in terms of growing the business, here's what I'm trying to do, here are the, if I can do it, I can create this number of jobs. These are the problems that are in my way. Can you help me? Those are all ways that other aspects of the economy use to get policymakers' attention in Washington. Also, I think being involved at home, back locally in the states and in the districts that these folks represent, and particularly catching the member of Congress, the senator or the congressman, when they're back home, when they're doing a speech or a meeting at the Chamber of Commerce, when they're doing a Rotary Club, to show up, ask for a meeting, work with the staff. It's all about relationships, about familiarity, about getting the members of Congress information, research. It's going to take a while, but bring them around. And then as these legislative initiatives, the Jobs Act, the Startup Act, and hopefully others get implemented, hopefully that they'll start to show results, and we can begin to overcome that conventional thinking and really begin to focus Washington on the topics of job creation and faster economic growth on the innovation economy.
I think it's incredibly appropriate that we're having this discussion at CES, because in so many ways, the tech industry, and CES in particular, is a microcosm of America. You have Eureka Park, the small startups, the Horatio Alger story.
I was just over there yesterday. It was great.
And then you have the ubiquitous brands that have arrived, which is what everyone's striving to do, and everything in between. But what we see here is that whether it's a company that's billion-dollar company or a small basement startup, innovation is the key to driving that success and thinking differently, utilizing the wisdom of the past, but thinking toward the future and what people will want. I think the combination of what you're doing in this book and the innovation we see here is a progressive, recipe for enlightenment and awareness.
Yeah, and I think another important point to make off of the point that you just made, as you say, there are a lot of established companies here. You see all the branding around great iconic companies, American technology companies. Very, very important. And I think most of them do what I'm about to say. I think most technology companies culturally, institutionally, remember and preserve internally their nature as a grown-up startup. That they once were over in Eureka Park, if not literally, but they were once at that stage of the game, and they remember what it was like and what the problems were that they dealt with in the early stages of the company, and some of the policy solutions that we've proposed and others have proposed that can really help those companies. So I think it's very important for these larger and more mature and frankly companies with more resources and who have a lot of clout in Washington, have a big footprint, are very active on their own specific issues, to also remain involved in those broader issues that are supportive of entrepreneurship and young innovation, because they're the next generation, and the older generation, I think, can be enormously helpful in overcoming this kind of conventional thinking that we were just talking about in Washington.
Well, as someone that writes about tech trends and is obsessed with innovation and I think that makes one an eternal optimist. So I tend to be optimistic. I have to say, reading this book made me more optimistic. I think the bottom line at this point is we need to make sure this message is heard. Thank you so much for being here today to talk to us. I think it behooves all of us to read this and spread the message and tell a friend. And John will be signing books over there. We go talk to him and pick up a copy of the book. John, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Sean, very much.
Our pleasure.